In this video, I'm going to go through the VPC Basic Setup Lab on my end and perform all of the steps. And of course, as always, I hope you did well on your own, but if you ran into any roadblocks or if you just want to see how I did it, then feel free to watch this video. And I do want to point out that some of these resources can get a little pricey if left alone for too long, so definitely once you're done with this lab, I recommend shutting down all of the resources that you created in this lab. So the first step in this lab was to create a new VPC in any region. So I'm going to go to Your VPCs and create VPC. For the name, Lab VPC will work just fine. For the IPv4 CIDR block, I'm going to give it a pretty standard CIDR block of 10.0.0.0/16. And then because we're not required to set anything up in IPv6 for this lab, I'm going to leave that alone. For tenancy, because we don't have any tenancy requirements in this lab, and because dedicated tenancy can get really expensive really fast, I'm definitely going to leave this on default and then create that VPC. And this can take just a moment. Oh, just kidding, there it is. So with the VPC created, our next goal was to create two subnets. So I'm going to go to subnets on the left side of the page. I'm going to create my first subnet. I'm going to call it lab private. And I'm going to deploy it into the VPC that I just created. So the VPC CIDR, of course, that's the one that we set for the VPC. Availability zone, because we don't have any requirements for availability zones in this lab, I'm going to leave it as no preference. And then for the CIDR block, I'm also going to give this a pretty standard subnet CIDR block. So 10.0.1.0/24. And then I'll hit create. Perfect. So obviously this one is going to be my private subnet, so I need to create a second subnet that I plan to be my public subnet. So lab public VPC. Once again, we're going to choose the VPC that we just created. I don't have a preference for the availability zone. And for the CIDR, I'll choose a different CIDR block with pretty standard subnet CIDR block. And that's it. So I've created two subnets, one that I plan to be public and one that I plan to be private. And I've deployed both of them into the new non-default VPC that I created. So the next step in this lab was to use a NAT gateway, an internet gateway, and route tables to make one subnet public and one private. Now, strictly speaking, a private subnet doesn't need a NAT gateway in order to be private. It only needs to not be attached to an internet gateway. But for practice purposes, we're still going to create a NAT gateway and associate it with our public or private subnet. And first things first, I'm going to go to Internet Gateways on the left side of the page. And then I've created it already, but the way that I did that was I created an Internet Gateway, I gave it a name, and then I hit create, and it's that simple. Now, please note that once you create an Internet Gateway, by default, it's not attached to a VPC. It'll say detached here. So what you do is highlight it, go to Actions, click Attach to VPC, and then what I did was select the VPC that I just created. Now the next step will be the NAT gateway. Now the NAT gateway will provide NAT translation for instances in the private subnet, but the NAT gateway itself has to be deployed to the public subnet. So let's grab the ID of the public subnet very quickly. Just the first few characters will do, 0D77. And let's go back to the NAT gateway and create NAT gateway. So once again, we want to deploy this into the public subnet right here, 0D77. And then NAT gateways will need an elastic IP, so we'll create one now, and it'll automatically throw that in the box for us. So let's create that NAT gateway. And let's close it out to make sure that it's going just fine, and it looks like it is. It's currently pending, so I'm going to place this video on a brief pause until that NAT gateway is ready for us. Alright, so that NAT gateway is available. So the next step is to use route tables to set everything up. So I'm going to go to route tables, and you'll notice right off the bat that we have two route tables, one that is the main route table for our default VPC, and one that is the main route table for our new VPC. For this lab, we're going to need two route tables for the new VPC. One that can route traffic from the public subnet to the Internet Gateway, and one that can route traffic from the private subnet to the NAT instance. Let's use the main route table as the route table for our Internet Gateway. We'll do that by clicking on the Routes tab at the bottom, clicking Edit, and then I'm going to add another route. So the destination will be everywhere, and the target is going to be the Internet Gateway. We'll save that. And now, because this route table has a destination and a target for an Internet Gateway, any subnet associated with this route table is a public subnet. Let's go ahead and associate our subnet with the route table right now. Edit. Then I'll find my public subnet and save it. And there you go. So now our public subnet has been explicitly associated with this route table. Now bear in mind, any subnets in a VPC that aren't explicitly associated with a route table are implicitly associated with the main route table, which means we still need to create a route table and associate our private subnet with the other route table. And let's do that now. Create route table, name tag, lab, private will be just fine, and I'll deploy it into my lab VPC and create it. And you'll notice that because we deployed it into the lab VPC, it has one route by default, and it routes all traffic in the VPC's CIDR range to local targets. Now though, we need to add another route and associate it with our NAT gateway. Save that. And there you go. Because this route table has a route for NAT gateways, but not Internet gateways, that means any subnet that's associated with this route table is not going to be a public subnet. So let's explicitly associate our private subnet with this route table. There we go. And that's done. So right now we should have one public subnet and one private subnet in our newly created VPC. So the next step was to create an EC2 instance using a LampStack AMI and deploy it into the new public subnet. Let's do that now. I'll open EC2 in a new tab and launch instance. So once again, I'm going to go to AWS Marketplace and I'm going to find my favorite LampStack AMI. I'll find a free tier eligible one. And I'm going to skip right on. I'm going to choose a free tier eligible type. For instance details, I'm going to find the VPC that I created. And because this is going to be a public instance that I want it to be in a public subnet, for this subnet, I'm going to choose the public subnet. So this lab doesn't require us to interact with the IAM role, shutdown behavior, tendency, or anything else like that. So I'm going to leave this alone. The default amount of storage is going to be fine for the purposes of this lab. And for tags, I've already entered this because I like to add my name tag. So I've given it a key of name and a value of VPC lab. Next, I'll go to security group. So in a previous lab, we made a security group for the LampStack, but recall that security groups are associated with VPCs. So if I want to select an existing security group, because we've chosen a new VPC, you'll notice that we don't have that security group as an option. So in this case, I'm going to create a new security group. As always, I'm going to lock down SSH access to my IP, and then we'll leave HTTP and HTTPS alone because we do want to try to access this instance over the internet. Finally, I'll review and launch, I'll use my temporary access key pair and launch the instance. Now the instance is going to take just a moment to configure, so I'm going to place this video on a brief hold and be right back. And that instance is up and running. So very quickly, before we test this instance by trying to navigate to it in a browser, it looks like when I created the instance, I left assign public IP on disable instead of switching it to enable. So I should have scanned that page more closely. But the way around that, one quick way is to assign an elastic IP to this instance. And I've already done that. And the way I did that was I went to elastic IPs, I allocated a new one, and then I found the new IP and associated it with the instance. And that's all there was to it. So now, as the very last step in this lab, we're going to navigate to this EC2 in a browser and verify that we can see a web application. So let's copy this. And there we go. We're successfully serving internet traffic with this instance, which means it is in a public subnet. And that's all there is to this lab. So if all of that makes sense, then feel free to move on.